A lowly grunt belongs by the door, next to the trash. Natalie leaned close when she said it. The heavy scent of her expensive jasmine perfume mixed with the sour stench of stale beer and rotting food wafting from the hotel service bins behind me. Through the thick oak doors of the Northern Virginia ballroom, the muffled bass of the wedding band pulsed against my ribs, a steady, mocking heartbeat. I looked down at the cream cardstock pinched between my cold fingers. Claire Maddox, table 34. Placed in the hallway, entirely removed from the reception. My sister adjusted the lace bodice of her custom wedding gown. She offered a perfect, rehearsed smile for a passing waiter carrying a tray of champagne. The moment the waiter turned the corner, the sweetness vanished from her face, leaving behind a cold, hard sneer. She had spent months crafting this perfect day, and part of that perfection involved making sure I knew exactly how little I mattered. "I thought you would have the decency to stay home," Natalie whispered, her voice tight with venom. "But since you insisted on showing your face, this is where you sit, out of sight." My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. I am 38 years old. I have spent 16 years in the United States Army, earning the rank of lieutenant colonel. I have managed supply lines in hostile territories and negotiated under the threat of actual gunfire. Now, I was standing in a dim hotel corridor, holding a small, wrapped box, listening to my younger sister treat me like a stain on the carpet. Natalie, a soft, fluttering voice, drifted into the hallway. My mother, Diane Maddox, stepped through the heavy doors. She clutched her beaded evening bag to her chest, already playing the role of the exhausted, long-suffering peacemaker. She wore a silver dress that caught the dim light of the corridor, her expression fixed into a mask of maternal disappointment. "Do not let her upset you on your special day, sweetheart," my mother said, placing a comforting hand on Natalie's arm. Then she turned her gaze to me, her eyes flat and empty of any warmth. "Claire, please, just sit down and be quiet. Do not ruin your sister's wedding. We have already dealt with enough of your drama." My father stepped out right behind her, letting the ballroom door swing shut. Richard straightened his tuxedo lapels, refusing to look me in the eye. He always took the path of least resistance, and in our family, the easiest path was agreeing with Diane. "Do as your mother says, Claire," my father muttered, waving a hand vaguely in my direction. "Sit by the door. It is more than you deserve after the way you abandoned this family." I looked at the three of them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of righteousness. These were the people who had spent the last 2 years systematically cutting me out of my grandfather's life. They had blocked my calls, intercepted my letters, and told the rest of the family that I was facing disciplinary action in the military. They had built a fortress of lies to explain why I was never around, all while cashing the checks I sent every month for Grandpa Thomas's care. I looked down at the small gift box in my hands. The silver wrapping paper felt smooth beneath my thumb. Inside rested Grandpa Thomas's old pocket watch, the one he carried every day of his life, along with copies of financial documents my mother and sister thought I would never find. The truth was heavy in my hands. I did not yell. I did not try to defend myself. Military discipline taught me to save my ammunition for the right target. "You are right, Natalie," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat, devoid of the anger she desperately wanted to see. "I do not belong here." I turned my back on them, I tightened my grip on the small box and took my first step toward the lobby. Behind me, I heard my mother let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. Natalie gave a soft, triumphant laugh. They thought they had won. They truly believed they had successfully hidden the disgraced daughter away and protected their perfect narrative. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed on the marble floor ahead of me. Someone was hurrying down the corridor from the main hotel entrance, walking with the undeniable cadence of a soldier. "Natalie, Evelyn needs you in the main hall for the cake cutting," a deep voice called out. I stopped moving. The man rounding the corner wore the dark blue dress uniform of a United States Army major. Gold oak leaves caught the glow of the wall sconces. Major Mason Reed, the groom. I knew Mason. 4 years ago, I had pulled him out of a career-ending internal investigation, untangling a mess of false accusations that would have stripped him of his rank. He was a good officer, a man of strict integrity. He was the last person I expected to see marrying into my family. Mason froze the second he saw me. His eyes swept over my face, registering the familiar features, before dropping to the hallway table bearing my name card next to the trash bins. Then he looked past me, spotting his bride, my mother, and my father standing in the shadows of the service door. The silence in the hallway stretched tight enough to snap. The muffled wedding music faded into white noise. Mason squared his broad shoulders. He brought his right hand up in a crisp, perfect, unwavering salute. "Colonel," Mason said, his voice ringing like a bell off the marble walls. I stood tall and returned the nod. "Major Reed." Behind me, Natalie let out a sharp, choked gasp, the sound of a woman drowning on dry land. I turned my head just enough to see my sister's face drain of all color. The smug bridal glow vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, suffocating panic. My mother stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth as if she had been slapped. My father suddenly looked very small inside his expensive tuxedo. Mason lowered his arm slowly. He looked at me with deep respect, then shifted his gaze directly to his bride. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. "Natalie," Mason asked, the warmth completely stripped from his tone, "why did you tell me your sister was discharged in disgrace?" Mason did not blink. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on my sister's pale, bloodless face. The gold buttons of his uniform caught the dim hallway light, glowing like tiny embers. He waited for an answer. Natalie swallowed hard. Her throat worked visibly, a frantic flutter against her diamond necklace. She reached out to touch Mason's arm, but her fingers trembled so badly she had to pull them back. "Mason, honey," Natalie said, forcing a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "You misunderstood me. You know how things get twisted. Claire used to be so dramatic about her rank, and I just meant she left the service quietly." My mother moved instantly to close the gap. Diane possessed an uncanny ability to sniff out a losing battle and rewrite the rules of engagement on the spot. She placed a hand on her chest, adopting the soft, fragile posture of a woman bearing an unbearable burden. "We were only trying to protect her, Mason," my mother murmured, letting a perfectly timed note of sorrow seep into her voice. Claire was in deep trouble. We kept it quiet because we love her. I listened to the lie slide smoothly from her lips. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, refined over the last 2 years. I knew exactly how my mother had sold this story to our relatives. Aunt Linda had left me a tearful voicemail last Christmas, begging me to get help. Diane had told everyone in the family chat that I was suffering from severe mental stress after a deployment. My mother had warned them all that calling me or asking about my military career could trigger a breakdown and jeopardize my security clearance. The family did not ignore me because they were cruel. They ignored me because they thought they were keeping me safe. Diane had weaponized their concern, sealing me in a vacuum of silence so she could control Grandpa Thomas's bank accounts without my interference. And recently, to stop Mason from asking questions as the wedding approached, Natalie had upgraded the lie to a full, disgraceful discharge. "Dishonor is not a private matter, Diane," Mason replied. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth the groom should have for his new family. He looked from my mother to my sister, recognizing the stench of a lie. My father stepped forward, his face flushed red above his stiff collar. Richard grabbed Mason by the elbow, attempting to steer the younger man toward the ballroom doors. "Come on, son," my father said, adopting a gruff, man-to-man tone. "Let it go. This is family business. We have a wedding to celebrate." Mason looked down at the hand on his elbow. He did not say a word, but the sudden chill in his posture made my father drop his grip immediately. To an active duty officer, falsely accusing a superior of being discharged in disgrace was not a simple family misunderstanding. It was character assassination. Natalie saw the disgust settling into Mason's eyes. Panic stripped away her elegant bridal poise. She turned her frantic gaze toward me, realizing that my presence in the hallway was no longer a silent victory. Her eyes dropped to the small, silver-wrapped box in my hands. "Just leave the gift, Claire," Natalie snapped, her voice spiking in pitch. "You made your scene. Now leave it on the table and go." A few minutes ago, she had called my gift cheap garbage. Now, she was staring at the small box with raw, naked terror. She wanted it out of my hands. She wanted it buried among the hundreds of expensive registry items inside the ballroom, where she could quietly throw it away later before anyone saw the contents. Before I could reply, the heavy doors at the end of the hallway pushed open. Evelyn Price, the high-priced wedding planner, hurried toward us with her clipboard pressed tight against her chest. She wore a black headset, her face slick with nervous sweat. "Natalie, please, the caterers are waiting for the signal," Evelyn pleaded, stopping abruptly when she noticed the suffocating tension in the corridor. Her eyes darted from Mason's rigid stance to my father's red face. She looked down at the table next to the trash bins, seeing my pristine seating card resting near a discarded cocktail napkin. "I am so sorry about the seating confusion," Evelyn babbled, desperately trying to smooth over the awkwardness. "I know this hallway is not ideal, but the arrangement came directly from the bride." My mother closed her eyes, a sharp inhale hissing through her teeth. Natalie shot Evelyn a look of pure hatred. Mason turned slowly back to me. His gaze drifted downward, settling on the silver wrapping paper in my grip. A thick ribbon held the paper together, and tied to the center of the bow was a heavy bronze coin. I watched recognition wash over his face. It was a military challenge coin, scarred along the edges, bearing the crest of my old unit. I had given it to him 4 years ago, slipping it onto his desk the morning I presented the evidence that cleared his name. It was a symbol of honor, a quiet promise that the truth always surfaces. "You planned this," Mason said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. He was not talking to me. He was staring dead at Natalie. "She is crazy, Mason," Natalie cried out, grabbing his arm with both hands. "Claire is just jealous. She is trying to ruin my day." Evelyn took a step back, her hands trembling as she pulled a sleek tablet from under her clipboard. The planner looked at Mason, her professional facade cracking under the weight of the moment. She tapped the screen once, her throat working hard before she spoke. "Major Reed," Evelyn said softly, holding the glowing screen out toward the groom. "I think you need to see the instructions your bride sent me last night." I did not need to look at the tablet. I already knew the words written there. The final piece of evidence proving my sister's perfect public mask was entirely fake. Mason took the device. He read the text message glowing in the dim light. "Put Claire by the trash. She will not make a scene. She never does." Mason slowly handed the tablet back to Evelyn, his expression hardening into cold, absolute stone. Mason did not raise his voice. He handed the glowing tablet back to the wedding planner and turned his attention entirely to the woman in the white gown. The silence stretching between them felt thick and suffocating. "Is this true, Natalie?" Mason said the words as a statement, completely devoid of a question mark. My sister shrank back. The intricate lace of her bodice suddenly looked like a cage trapping her in place. "Mason, you are taking this completely out of context," she stammered, her voice pitching high and thin. "Evelyn is stressed. People say things they do not mean when planning a massive event like this." Evelyn Price stepped away from the couple, pressing her back against the flocked wallpaper. The planner refused to take the blame for the cruelty of her client. She clutched her clipboard tightly against her chest, her knuckles turning white. "I did not write the message," Evelyn whispered, staring down at her own shoes. "The bride did." My mother moved fast. Diane stepped between the groom and her youngest daughter, throwing her arms open like a protective shield. The silver fabric of her evening gown rustled loudly in the quiet corridor. "Mason, please try to understand," my mother pleaded, letting a practiced tremor shake her perfectly painted lips. "Claire has always been difficult. She has always been fiercely jealous of her sister. You have no idea what Natalie has had to endure to make this beautiful day happen." I watched the performance unfold with a familiar, dull ache in my chest. Diane had perfected this exact routine for decades. Whenever Natalie broke a window, my mother somehow convinced the entire neighborhood that I was the one who threw the rock. It was a survival mechanism for their golden child dynamic, and I was always the designated collateral damage. "She just wanted to ruin my biggest milestone," the bride cried, grabbing handfuls of her expensive silk skirt. Tears welled in her eyes, finally spilling over her expertly applied mascara. Claire could never stand seeing me happy. That is the only reason she came here today. She wanted to destroy my wedding. A heavy oak door creaked open further down the hall. A bridesmaid in a pale pink dress stepped out, her phone clutched in her hand. Behind her, a middle-aged cousin named Greg peeked through the doorway, holding a half-empty cocktail glass. Two servers carrying large silver trays paused near the service elevator, their eyes wide. The private family dispute was rapidly spilling into the public domain. Murmurs rippled through the small gathered crowd. Cousin Greg leaned over and whispered something to the bridesmaid. They both looked at the weeping bride, then shifted their suspicious gazes toward me. I did not want an audience. The military taught me to handle conflicts behind closed doors, far away from civilian casualties. The air in the hallway smelled of spilled champagne and expensive floral arrangements, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to breathe clean air. I looked directly at the groom. "Major Reed, congratulations on your marriage," I said, keeping my tone measured and completely calm. "I am removing myself from the premises right now. You will not have to worry about a scene." I turned on my heel and took 2 heavy steps toward the lobby corridor. "Stop right there," Natalie shouted, her voice echoing sharply against the cold marble floors. I paused, looking over my shoulder. My sister shoved past our mother, her bridal heels clicking loudly on the stone as she marched forward. Her face was flushed, dark red, and the fragile victim narrative cracked entirely under the weight of her own desperation. "You are not leaving until you give me that box," Natalie demanded. Her eyes locked onto the small, silver-wrapped package resting in my palm. She was breathing fast, her chest heaving beneath the tight silk and lace. The bride did not care about me walking away or keeping the peace. She only cared about the hidden evidence I carried. "A few minutes ago, you called this a cheap piece of junk," I reminded her, turning fully around to face the anger radiating from her. "Why do you want it so badly now?" "It is a wedding gift," the bride snapped, holding out a shaking hand. "You brought it for me. Leave it on the table right now." Mason stepped closer to the woman he was supposed to marry. He stared at her extended hand, watching the fine, uncontrollable tremors racking her fingers. "Natalie, just let her leave," the groom said, his voice laced with heavy, undeniable suspicion. "If the gift is just junk, why do you care so much about keeping it?" "Because she is trying to make me look bad," my sister fired back, twisting around to glare at the man in the dress uniform. "She wants everyone to think I am turning away her pathetic peace offering. She is unstable, Mason. Mom told you she was unstable." Diane nodded vigorously, wiping a non-existent tear from her powdered cheek. "It is the terrible stress of her service. We tried so hard to get her professional help over the years." "Excuse me." The new voice was small, but it cut right through the heavy, toxic air of the hallway. We all turned to see a young woman in a black catering uniform standing near the service elevator. She held a smartphone pressed tight against her apron. The caterer swallowed hard, clearly terrified to speak up to the wealthy clients renting out the luxury ballroom. She shifted her weight from foot to foot. "I am so sorry to interrupt," the young woman said, her gaze darting anxiously toward the wedding planner. "Evelyn told us to document any serious issues with guests today, just in case someone complained to hotel management later." Evelyn closed her eyes and nodded slowly, silently giving the girl permission to continue. "I was standing right inside the service doors when the bride came out earlier," the caterer continued, stepping forward into the light of the sconces. "I thought there was going to be a physical altercation, so I hit record on my phone." Natalie froze instantly. The dark flush of anger drained from her face a second time, leaving her looking like a hollow wax statue. "Delete that," my father ordered, stepping aggressively toward the young woman. Richard pointed a thick, demanding finger at the terrified server. "Delete that video right now. You have absolutely no right to film my family." Mason intercepted the older man. The major simply shifted his weight, placing his broad, decorated frame squarely between the angry father and the catering staff member. "Let her play it, sir," Mason said softly. My father stopped moving entirely. Nobody argued with the specific tone the major used right then. It was the calm, dangerous voice of a man completely accustomed to giving orders in combat zones. Richard slowly lowered his pointing finger and backed away. The young caterer tapped her cracked screen. The recorded audio played, sounding loud and painfully clear in the echoing corridor. "I thought you would have the decency to stay home," the recorded voice of the bride hissed from the tiny speaker. "But since you insisted on showing your face, this is where you sit, out of sight." The bridesmaid standing down the hall gasped aloud. Cousin Greg quickly covered his mouth with his free hand. The recording continued, capturing the cruel, unmistakable sneer in my sister's tone. "A lowly grunt belongs by the door, next to the trash." The audio clicked off. The caterer slipped the phone back into her apron pocket and quickly retreated toward the elevator. The silence that followed the recording felt heavy enough to crush bone. Mason looked at his bride. Every ounce of remaining warmth died completely in his eyes. He realized he had almost pledged his life and his honor to a woman who genuinely enjoyed humiliating her own flesh and blood. Natalie looked wildly around the hallway. The faces staring back at her from the gathered crowd held absolutely no sympathy. Her perfect public mask lay shattered in pieces on the marble floor. She scrambled desperately for a lifeline, her eyes locking onto me with pure, distilled hatred. "You set me up!" Natalie screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You came here specifically to ruin my reputation. You are a bitter, lonely woman, and you want to drag me down into the dirt with you." My mother stepped forward again, her voice shaking with manufactured theatrical rage. "How could you do this to your own sister, Claire? After everything we did to protect you, we should have never let you back into our lives." I watched the two women weave their final web of manipulation. They were trying to make the public humiliation about my supposed jealousy. They were trying to keep the argument entirely focused on social etiquette, wedding drama, and hurt feelings. They desperately did not want anyone looking deeper into the real rot beneath the floorboards. I pulled the thick ribbon on the gift box. The bronze challenge coin slipped loose, clattering softly onto the wooden table beside the trash bins. "I did not come here to ruin your reputation, Natalie," I said. The cold, sleeping anger in my chest finally began to spread outward, sharpening my words into blades. "I came here to give you one last chance to tell the truth before it was entirely out of your hands." The bride stared at the silver box. Her breathing grew shallow and incredibly rapid. "I have absolutely nothing to tell you." I lifted the cardboard lid. "Did you use Grandpa's name to pay for this wedding?" The question hung in the air, instantly sucking all the remaining oxygen out of the hallway. My father let out a choked, wet cough. He blindly grabbed the edge of the hallway table to steady his shaking legs, knocking over a discarded champagne flute. The glass shattered loudly on the stone floor, but nobody bothered to look down. Diane grabbed Natalie's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the white silk. My mother opened her mouth to speak, to offer another lie, but no sound came out of her throat. The bridesmaid standing down the hall pulled out her phone and began typing frantically. The family rumor mill had officially shifted from a cruel, spoiled bride to something far more dangerous. Elder financial abuse was not a private family matter. Mason stood perfectly still. He looked down at the open silver box, then up at the terrified faces of my family. "What is she talking about, Natalie?" the groom demanded. My sister leaned close to me, completely ignoring the man she was supposed to marry. She lowered her voice to a desperate, frantic whisper, meant only for my ears. "You cannot prove anything," Natalie hissed, her eyes wide and wild like a trapped animal. "Grandpa signed everything. It was all perfectly legal." I looked down at the copied financial documents resting inside the box. Then I looked my younger sister dead in the eye, feeling nothing but quiet resolve. "That is the problem, Natalie," I replied, my voice steady and completely hollow. He could not even understand the bills by then. My sister stared at me, the words hanging in the air between us like heavy, suffocating smoke. "That is the problem, Natalie," I repeated, my voice steady and entirely hollow. He could not even understand the bills by then. My mother moved with terrifying speed. Diane lunged across the narrow space, her manicured fingers clawing desperately toward the silver box in my hands. Her heavy perfume washed over me, a cloying wave of roses and alcohol that made my stomach turn. "Give me that, right now," my mother hissed, her teeth bared in a vicious grimace that stripped away every ounce of her refined country club elegance. "You have no right to bring his things here. You are tarnishing the memory of a good man just to ruin your sister." I shifted my weight, turning my shoulder to block her advance, and pulled the cardboard lid free. The silver wrapping paper tore and drifted toward the marble floor. Inside the small box rested Grandpa Thomas's old gold pocket watch. The tarnished metal caught the light of the hallway sconces. Faint scratches covered the glass face, marking decades of daily use. Even now, standing in a hotel corridor, surrounded by people who hated me, I could almost smell the faint scent of wintergreen mints and old leather that always lingered in his coat pockets. Beneath the watch sat a neat stack of folded papers, along with 2 thick envelopes bearing the logo of his local bank. "Nobody is tarnishing his memory," I said, looking down at the watch. "But someone certainly emptied his accounts." Mason stepped forward. The groom did not ask for permission. He simply reached out and gently lifted the top piece of paper from the box. My father let out a low, panicked groan. Richard took half a step toward the major, his hands raised in a weak gesture of surrender, but he stopped when Mason shot him a cold, warning glance. The document Mason held was a standard legal form, filled with dense paragraphs of legalese and stamped with a notary seal. It was a durable power of attorney granting complete control over medical and financial decisions. Mason was an Army officer. He spent half his career reviewing supply manifests, incident reports, and legal briefings. His eyes scanned the page with practiced efficiency, immediately seeking out the vital details that anchored any official document. "This is Academy financial power of attorney," Mason said, reading the bold text at the top of the page. He looked up at my sister. "You and your mother are listed as the primary agents. Because we were the ones taking care of him." Natalie shot back, her voice shrill and trembling. "Claire was never around. She abandoned him when he got sick. Grandpa wanted us to have control so we could manage his care facility payments." The lie flowed out of her with practiced ease, but the desperate panic in her eyes betrayed her completely. Mason did not respond to the bride. He simply looked back down at the document. He flipped to the second page, tracing his finger along the signature lines at the bottom. "The date on this document is August 12th, 2024, Mason read aloud, the absolute certainty in his voice echoing off the stone walls. He lifted his head and stared directly at my father. "And you signed as the primary witness, sir." Richard swallowed so hard I could hear the click of his throat. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the dim light. The older man looked wildly around the hallway, his eyes darting from the shocked faces of the catering staff to the horrified expression of the wedding planner. "It was a family matter," my father mumbled, his voice weak and pathetic. "Diane said we needed the paperwork done quickly so the nursing home would not kick him out. I just signed where she told me to sign." "You witnessed a legal signature," Mason corrected him, his tone dropping an octave. "You signed your name stating that Thomas Maddox was of sound mind and fully understood the powers he was signing away." The paper was entirely legal on the surface. It had the right stamps, the right signatures, and the right formatting. But the truth was buried beneath the dates printed in black ink, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough. "He did understand," Diane shouted, stepping in front of her shrinking husband. The matriarch of the family pointed a shaking finger at my chest. He knew exactly what he was doing. "You were not there, Claire. You have absolutely no idea what his mental state was like. You just want to swoop in now and play the hero after ignoring him for 3 years." I reached into the box and pulled out a stack of printed bank receipts. I unfolded them slowly, making sure the crisp rustle of the paper echoed in the quiet space. "I was not there in person because you told the nursing staff to block my calls," I said, handing the top receipt to Mason. "But my money was certainly there." The groom looked at the paper. It was a standard wire transfer confirmation from my military credit union. $1,000, Mason read, his brow furrowing as he looked at the date, "transferred on the 1st of every month." And the memo line says, "For Grandpa's care." Cousin Greg, still standing near the service doors, let out a sharp gasp. He turned to the bridesmaid next to him, his face twisting in genuine shock. "Diane told us last Thanksgiving that Claire never sent a single dime. She said they were drowning in medical debt because Claire refused to help." The murmurs in the hallway grew louder. The carefully constructed wall of lies my mother had built around me was finally beginning to crumble, brick by brick. "It was a loan," Natalie cried, stepping closer to Mason and grabbing his sleeve. "She owed our parents money from college. She just wrote that on the memo line to make herself look good." I did not bother arguing with her ridiculous excuse. Instead, I let my mind drift back to the final phone call I had managed to sneak through to my grandfather right before my mother confiscated his personal cell phone entirely. I remembered the sound of his raspy, confused voice. Grandpa Thomas had asked me what day it was. Then he asked me why I never came to visit. When I told him I had tried to call the facility desk 5 times that week, he sounded incredibly small, like a lost child wandering in a dark woods. He told me Diane said I was too busy with my new friends to care about an old man. He asked the same question 3 times in a span of 10 minutes. My grandfather was a brilliant, sharp-minded veteran who used to build intricate wooden ship models by hand. By the spring of 2024, he could not remember how to use a television remote. I reached into the box one last time. I pulled out a single sheet of standard printer paper. It was not a complex legal document, nor was it a heavily protected medical record. It was simply a screenshot of a text message, printed in full color, showing the sender's name and the exact timestamp. My mother stared at the piece of paper, finally realizing that every trap she had set for me had a back door she never knew about. "You claim he was of sound mind when he signed that power of attorney in August," I said, my voice cutting through the rising whispers of the wedding guests. "But you sent me this text message in May, 3 months earlier." I held the paper up so Mason could see it clearly. "Read it, Major." Mason took the printed screenshot. He held it up to the light, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. "It is from Diane Maddox," Mason read, his voice projecting clearly down the hallway. It says, "Dad can barely remember my name today. He cannot even understand the medical bills anymore. The facility is asking for more money. Just send the cash, and I will handle the paperwork." The silence returned, heavier, and far more dangerous than before. My mother's own words had betrayed her. She had admitted in writing that her father lacked the basic cognitive capacity to understand a simple bill. Yet, 90 days later, she paraded him in front of a notary and had my father witness a document handing over total control of his life savings. Diane stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. The silver dress suddenly looked absurd and gaudy on a woman caught entirely in a web of financial exploitation. She had no clever excuse left. She could not gaslight a printed text message she had sent from her own phone. "It is fake!" Natalie screamed, her voice cracking violently. The bride slapped her hands against her silk skirt, stomping her foot like a furious toddler denied a toy. She printed that at home. She probably made a fake contact on her phone to set us up. "This is just a copy of some random text, Mason. It means absolutely nothing in the real world." The desperation rolling off my sister was almost sad to witness. She truly believed that if she screamed loud enough, the truth would simply bow its head and walk away. "You are absolutely right, Natalie," I said, calmly closing the cardboard lid of the small gift box. "These are just copies." Natalie stopped screaming. She looked at me, confusion warring with the terror in her wide eyes. "I knew you would try to destroy the evidence if I brought the original files into this room," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "The original power of attorney, the bank statements, the phone records, and the text messages are not here. They have been sitting on my attorney's desk in downtown Washington since Tuesday morning." My mother let out a small, wounded noise, clutching her beaded evening bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You hired a lawyer," Richard whispered, the remaining color draining rapidly from his face. "Claire, you cannot do that. We are family. If there was a misunderstanding about the accounts, we can sit down and figure it out privately." "There is no misunderstanding," Mason interrupted, stepping entirely away from the bride. The groom looked down at the documents still resting in his hands. He looked at the fake power of attorney, the undeniable text message, and the wire transfers, proving I had never abandoned my grandfather. Then he looked at the sealed bank envelopes remaining in the open box. "Colonel Maddox," Mason said, reverting entirely to military protocol, seeking the cold comfort of rank in the middle of a civilian nightmare, "the text message proves your grandfather was incapacitated. The power of attorney gave them access to his money." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath. How much money moved out of his accounts after this document was signed? I picked up the thickest envelope from the box. The seal was already broken. I slid out 3 pages of highlighted bank statements, holding them by the corner so the heavy, unmistakable numbers caught the light. "Enough to pay for this room," I replied. "Enough to pay for this room." Mason's jaw locked. The muscles beneath his skin feathered tight, creating a sharp, rigid line along his profile. He turned his head slowly toward Evelyn Price, who was still clutching her digital tablet against her chest like a protective shield. "Miss Price," the major said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register that commanded instant obedience. "Tell the band to take a break. Hold the catering staff in the kitchen. Please pause the service and ask hotel security to keep the hallway clear until we understand what is happening." Evelyn nodded frantically, backing away toward the service elevator without making a sound. My father tried to grab Mason's shoulder, reaching out with a trembling hand, but the younger man stepped out of reach before Richard could make contact. "We are going into that side room right now," Mason ordered, gesturing toward the heavy mahogany doors of the private bridal suite just off the corridor. "And we are going to finish this conversation away from your guests." Natalie dug her heels into the marble floor. Her custom lace gown rustled aggressively as she shook her head, sending a loose curl tumbling out of her elaborate updo. "No, I am not going anywhere with her." "Mason, the ceremony is supposed to start in 20 minutes. People are waiting for us. We cannot just disappear into a back room." The groom did not argue. He simply looked at the woman he had planned to marry, and whatever he saw in her wide, panicked eyes made him reach out and push the brass handle of the suite door himself. He stepped inside and waited, leaving the doorway open like a challenge. Diane grabbed her youngest daughter by the elbow, whispering furiously into her ear. The two women marched past Mason, their heads held high in a desperate, crumbling imitation of offended dignity. Richard followed them like a beaten dog, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. I walked in last, carrying the open silver box and the thick stack of bank statements. The bridal suite smelled overwhelmingly of hairspray, wilted white roses, and nervous sweat. Half-empty champagne flutes littered a glass coffee table in the center of the space. Discarded makeup brushes and bobby pins covered the vanity. I set the gift box down on a velvet ottoman and spread the bank papers across the smooth glass surface of the table. The fluorescent yellow highlighter ink I had used to mark the transactions glowed brightly against the stark white pages. "Let us start at the top," I said, placing my index finger on a line dated late October 2025. $15,000 transferred directly to the Oak Ridge Country Club. That is the venue deposit for this exact room. My sister scoffed loudly, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She refused to look down at the numbers. Grandpa wanted me to have a beautiful wedding. He always told me I deserved the best. He wanted to give me a gift. I moved my finger down the page, sliding over the bold black print. $8,000 in January to a bridal boutique in Georgetown. Another $12,000 in March for the floral designer. $7,000 just last month to a luxury resort in the Maldives. I looked up, meeting her furious, desperate glare. Did Grandpa Thomas also want to pay for your honeymoon suite while his own assisted living facility payments bounced twice in a row? Natalie flinched. The bride looked quickly toward the groom, trying to gauge his reaction and searching for any sign of sympathy, but Mason stood near the closed door like a stone statue. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing yellow lines of the bank statements. "It was a reimbursement," my mother interjected, stepping forward to physically block my view of her golden child. Diane pressed her hands flat against the edge of the glass table, leaning her weight toward me. "We paid for a lot of his extra medical supplies out of pocket, Claire. Those transfers were just the estate paying us back for the money we spent keeping him comfortable during those hard months." "Do not lie to him, Diane," I said softly. I did not raise my voice, allowing the absolute certainty of the documented evidence to speak for me. I checked the medical supply invoices with the facility director. The nursing home provided absolutely everything he needed. You did not spend a single dime of your own money. My mother's eyes narrowed into dark, vicious slits. The polished country club matriarch vanished completely, leaving behind someone much colder. "You are a monster," Diane hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifyingly flawless imitation of manufactured grief. "You are standing here on your sister's wedding day, using a dead man's bank accounts to settle some petty childhood grudge. You abandoned him when he needed you most, and now you want to punish us for being the ones who stayed by his side." I felt a cold knot tighten behind my ribs. The sudden urge to scream at her, to shatter the glass table, and demand she admit what she had done to my grandfather, surged up the back of my throat, tasting like copper and ash. I swallowed it down. Decades of military discipline held the line, keeping my face perfectly blank. "I sent money every single month," I replied, my voice remarkably steady, though my hands felt entirely numb. "You intercepted it. You isolated him. You told the nursing staff I did not care enough to visit, and then you used his daily care fund to buy decorative flowers." Richard finally broke under the pressure. My father dropped heavily onto a small velvet chair in the corner of the room, burying his face in his large, shaking hands. He could not look at the bank statements spread across the table. He could not look at the army major standing by the door. He definitely could not look at me. Mason walked slowly toward the glass table, The heavy tread of his uniform shoes sank deep into the plush carpet, a steady, rhythmic thud in the quiet room. He looked down at the yellow highlights, tracing the chronological timeline with his dark eyes. He stopped at the date of the power of attorney signature, then dragged his gaze down to the massive luxury withdrawals that began immediately after that fake document was stamped. The math was entirely undeniable. The timeline formed a straight, devastating line from elder exploitation to a luxury wedding reception. Mason reached inside the breast pocket of his dark blue tunic. His large hand emerged holding a small, square velvet box. Natalie let out a sharp, ragged gasp that echoed loudly off the mirrored walls of the suite. "Mason, what are you doing?" The groom did not answer her. He pressed his thumb against the brass clasp of the ring box. The lid popped open with a quiet, devastating click. Inside, a heavy diamond wedding band caught the bright vanity lights, glittering brightly against the dark interior fabric. It was the ring he was supposed to slide onto her finger in front of 300 cheering guests in less than 10 minutes. Mason stared down at the ring for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he snapped the box shut. The sharp sound of the lid closing severed whatever remaining hope my sister had been clinging to. The reality of the situation finally crashed down over her perfect bridal illusion, shattering it into pieces. "You cannot do this!" Natalie shrieked, her hands flying to her head, tangling desperately in the delicate netting of her expensive veil. She lunged forward, grabbing Mason's tunic with both hands, her manicured nails digging deep into the dark fabric. "She is lying to you, Mason. Claire is manipulating you. You cannot just take her word over mine." Mason gently, but firmly, pried her trembling fingers off his uniform. He took half a step backward, creating a strict physical boundary between them. "I am not taking her word, Natalie," the major said, his voice terrifyingly calm and completely devoid of anger. "I am looking at official bank records. I am looking at a text message your own mother sent, explicitly admitting your grandfather lacked basic cognitive function. And I am looking at a man sitting in the corner who cannot even make eye contact with me because he knows he witnessed a fraudulent legal document." "But everyone knows she is crazy," my sister screamed, spinning around to point a shaking finger directly at my face. Her chest heaved rapidly, and a dark smear of mascara ran down her left cheek, ruining her perfect makeup. "Ask Aunt Linda. Ask Cousin Greg. The whole family knows Claire was discharged in disgrace. She has absolutely no honor. She has no credibility at all. You are choosing a disgraced failure over your own bride." Mason looked at the weeping woman in the white dress, his expression shifting from disgust to profound, heavy pity. "Your sister was never discharged in disgrace," Mason stated, his clear voice cutting straight through the hysterical noise filling the small suite. "She is a lieutenant colonel in active service." Natalie shook her head frantically, refusing to process the words. "No, Mom said she was in trouble. Mom said her career was over years ago." "Your mother lied to you," the groom replied, his eyes moving past the bride to pin Diane in place. "Or you both lied together. It does not matter anymore." Mason turned his body slightly, addressing the room at large, but keeping his intense gaze locked on the bride. 4 years ago, an anonymous group filed false reports against my unit," Mason said, his words falling like heavy stones onto the glass table. "They accused my command of missing inventory and severe negligence. It was a targeted character assassination meant to end my military career before I ever reached the rank of major." I kept my face perfectly still, watching my family process the sudden influx of reality. They had spent 2 years building a convenient narrative of my failure, completely unaware of the actual life I led outside their toxic suburban bubble. "Colonel Maddox was the investigating officer assigned to my case," Mason continued, gesturing toward me with a sharp nod of deep respect. "She spent 6 grueling weeks tearing through supply logs and interrogating hostile witnesses. She faced intense pressure from senior brass to close the file quickly and let me take the fall. Instead, she found the actual thieves, cleared my name entirely and saved my career. She is the most honorable officer I have ever served under." The room went dead silent. The air conditioning vent hummed softly overhead, pushing cold air down the back of my neck. My sister looked exactly like she had been physically struck across the face. The ultimate weapon she and my mother had used to discredit me, the phantom disciplinary action, had just shattered completely against the solid wall of Mason's first-hand experience. They had tried to paint me as a deranged liar to the one man who owed his entire professional life to my unwavering commitment to the truth. Diane opened her mouth, her eyes darting around the room as she frantically searched for a new angle, a new lie, a new way to spin the absolute devastation of her plans. Before my mother could form a single word, the heavy mahogany door of the bridal suite cracked open. A young woman in a pale pink chiffon dress stood in the doorway. It was the same bridesmaid from the hallway, the one who had listened to the caterer's audio recording by the trash bins. Her face was entirely ashen, her eyes wide with a mixture of raw horror and morbid fascination. "Natalie," the bridesmaid whispered, her voice trembling so badly, the word broke in half. My sister whipped around, her ruined makeup and wild hair making her look entirely feral. "What? What is it? Tell Evelyn to clear the hallway. Tell everyone to sit down in their seats and wait for the music." The bridesmaid swallowed hard, gripping the brass door handle with both hands just to keep herself standing upright. She looked past the frantic bride, making direct eye contact with my mother, then slowly shifted her terrified gaze down to the highlighted bank statements spread across the glass coffee table. "Evelyn cannot clear the hall," the young woman said, her voice cracking painfully on the final word. The videographer had a wireless microphone clipped to a flower stand near the service doors. He was trying to catch ambient audio for the wedding video. Natalie froze instantly. Her shaking hands dropped slowly to her sides, the white silk of her gown brushing against the carpet. The audio feed was patched directly into the main ballroom speakers while the guests waited for the ceremony to start, the bridesmaid continued, taking a hesitant step backward into the safety of the corridor. She looked at my sister with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Natalie, the live stream is still on." The words hit the bridal suite like a physical blow. Natalie stopped breathing. Her eyes widened, staring blankly at the pale bridesmaid in the doorway. My sister did not scream, and she did not cry. She simply turned and bolted. Layers of white silk rushed past me, knocking a half-empty champagne flute off the edge of the glass coffee table. The crystal shattered against the carpet, but the bride was already gone, sprinting frantically down the corridor toward the main reception hall. Mason followed her immediately, his heavy uniform boots thudding rhythmically on the marble floor. I gathered my silver box and the highlighted bank statements, stepping out of the suite right behind my father and Diane. We reached the grand ballroom entrance just as Natalie pushed through the thick double oak doors. The heavy, warm scent of roasted prime rib and expensive white lilies rolled out into the hallway, suffocating and sweet. Inside, there was absolutely no music playing. 300 guests sat in total, paralyzing silence. The 10-piece wedding band stood frozen on the raised stage, their brass instruments resting silently at their sides. Every single face in the massive room was turned toward the entrance, staring directly at the frantic bride. They had heard everything. The open microphone clipped to a flower stand by the service door had broadcast the entire argument through the overhead speakers. The guests had listened to the stolen money trail, the fake legal document, and the undeniable proof of an abandoned grandfather. Natalie grabbed the edges of her lace bodice, desperately pulling her shoulders back to fix her posture. She stretched her trembling mouth into a wide, terrifyingly bright smile. "Hello, everyone," the bride called out, her voice echoing painfully over the silent tables. "I am so sorry for the delay. We just had a silly misunderstanding with a vendor in the back hallway. You know how stressful weddings can be. Please, get a drink and enjoy the appetizers." Nobody moved a muscle. A few guests looked down at their pristine white plates. Others traded horrified, sideways glances. Near the front table, a waiter slowly lowered a silver water pitcher, completely unsure of what to do. My mother grabbed my elbow from behind, her painted acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin through the fabric of my jacket. Diane leaned close, dropping her voice to a vicious, frantic whisper meant only for me. "Fix this right now," my mother ordered, her breath hot and smelling of mint against my ear. "Tell them it was a joke. If you do not shut your mouth this instant, I swear to God, Claire, I will stand on that stage and tell the entire family how you left your grandfather to rot in that facility. I will make sure they never speak to you again." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm, feeling nothing but a profound, exhausted pity for the woman holding me. Then I looked past my mother, locking eyes with an older woman sitting at the closest reception table. Aunt Linda wore a dark navy dress, her hands trembling as she clutched a linen cloth napkin. She had always been Grandpa Thomas's favorite niece. She was also the primary gossip pipeline for the entire extended family. I did not bother whispering. I stepped away from Diane's grip and lifted the thick stack of bank transfer receipts. "Aunt Linda," I said, projecting my voice clearly across the silent room, "when Grandpa moved into the nursing home, what did Diane tell you about his daily care?" Aunt Linda swallowed hard, looking nervously between my furious mother and the official documents resting in my hand. "Diane told us you refused to help him. She said she was drowning in medical debt because you never sent a single dime to the family." I walked over to the circular table and set the thick stack of receipts right next to her dinner plate. "Those are wire transfers from my military credit union," I explained, watching the older woman pull out her wire-rimmed reading glasses. $1,000 a month, every single month for 3 years. The memo line clearly states the money was specifically for his daily care. Aunt Linda looked at the dates, tracing the bold black numbers with a shaking finger. She looked up, her eyes filling with sudden angry tears. She ignored me completely and turned her glare directly toward my mother. "You asked our church group to pray for your financial struggles," Aunt Linda said, her voice rising sharply in the quiet room. "You collected charity donations from the congregation, Diane. You took their money while you were secretly cashing Claire's checks." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom like a sudden gust of cold wind. The public mask my mother had worn for decades fractured completely, the pieces falling away to reveal the absolute truth beneath. Diane was not just a protective parent covering for a spoiled child. She was the architect of the entire lie. She had stolen the money, built the false narrative, and used my absence to play the suffering martyr for social sympathy and financial gain. Mason stood near the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched the matriarch crumble, his face an unreadable mask of military discipline. Natalie realized the crowd was slipping entirely out of their control. The bride abandoned her fake smile, her face twisting into a desperate, feral snarl. She pointed a shaking finger at me from the center of the polished dance floor. "She is making all of this up," Natalie screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the crystal chandeliers. "Do you not see what she is doing? Claire just wants his money. She knows Grandpa left the remaining estate to me, so she is faking bank records to steal my inheritance. She is a greedy, jealous liar." The accusation was so absurd it barely registered as a threat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. "I do not want a single penny of his estate, Natalie," I replied, unlocking the screen with my thumb. "And I did not come here alone today. I brought a witness who knows exactly what happened inside that nursing facility." My mother scoffed loudly, crossing her arms tightly over her silver evening gown to hide her shaking hands. "Nobody is going to believe some random person you paid to lie for you." "She is not a random person," I said, tapping a specific name in my contact list and hitting the speakerphone icon. "Her name is Nurse Angela Brooks. She was his primary daytime caretaker." I held the phone up high. The line rang twice, the sound echoing loudly in the massive room, before a calm, professional voice answered the call. "Hello, Claire," the nurse said. The sound of the caretaker's voice made Diane freeze completely. Her smug confidence vanished, replaced instantly by sheer, unfiltered panic. "Angela," I said, keeping the phone angled toward the crowd. "My mother is telling the family that I abandoned Grandpa Thomas. She claims I never checked on him and that I just want his money." The line remained quiet for a brief, tense moment. When Angela finally spoke again, her tone was careful, measured, and entirely aware of the strict legal boundaries surrounding her profession. "Claire, I cannot discuss his medical chart over a speakerphone, and I will absolutely not share his diagnosis with a room full of people," the nurse stated clearly, her strict adherence to the law making her words infinitely more devastating. "But I will gladly tell your attorney exactly what your mother instructed the facility staff to do." The ballroom went deathly quiet. Nurse Angela's words cut through the tension with a clinical, unyielding precision that Diane could not manipulate or scream away. "I remember the instructions clearly," Angela continued through the phone, her voice steady and professional. "Your mother repeatedly told our nursing staff that any calls or letters from a Lieutenant Colonel Claire Maddox were to be intercepted. She claimed you were unstable and that contact would trigger a violent episode, so she insisted on blocking all communication for his own protection." Diane let out a sharp, choked sound, her face turning a mottled shade of red. She tried to grab the phone from my hand, but I stepped back, keeping the device well out of her reach. "Is that all?" I asked the nurse, my eyes locked on my mother's crumbling expression. "No," Angela replied. "There is more. Your grandfather spent every single afternoon asking why his granddaughter had forgotten him. He was a proud man, but towards the end, he would sit by the facility window for hours, holding that old pocket watch, waiting for a car that never arrived. Your mother came in on Tuesdays and Fridays. She would take his personal phone, go into the private hallway, and talk to someone for nearly an hour. Every time she came back into his room, he became quieter. He stopped asking for Claire for the rest of the day, and he would stop asking about you for a few days." I felt a sharp, burning tear track through the heavy makeup I had applied for this wedding. I had wondered for 2 long years why the man who taught me how to read maps and respect the truth had stopped calling my name. The answer was not indifference. It was a calculated, daily campaign to break his heart before his mind failed entirely. "You are a liar," my mother shrieked, finally lunging forward to snatch at the phone. "You are just a bitter woman who was fired for incompetence, and now you are trying to ruin a wedding to feel important." "I was never fired," Angela responded calmly, unfazed by the hysterics. "I retired with a clean record last month. I am calling from my home, Diane. If you continue to accuse me of lying, I will be more than happy to present the facility's call logs and the staff statements regarding your behavior to the authorities." The phone line went dead as I hit the end button. I slipped the device back into my pocket, the silence in the ballroom now heavy with the weight of absolute, documented truth. Natalie looked around the room, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She searched for an ally, for someone to believe her, for a single person in the massive crowd who would stand up and shout that I was the villain. But the guests had seen the bank statements, they had heard the audio recording, and they had just witnessed a professional nurse dismantle my mother's reputation in under 2 minutes. Nobody stood up. Aunt Linda was already packing her purse, her jaw set in a line of cold, indignant anger. Cousin Greg refused to meet my sister's eyes, staring intently at the floor. The bride's entire world was evaporating in real time. Richard slowly sank into the nearest banquet chair, his posture defeated. He looked at his wife, then at his oldest daughter, and finally at his own shaking hands. "I did not know it was this bad, Diane," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. "You said the money was just to pay for his mounting medical bills." "Shut your mouth, Richard," my mother snapped, her composure completely gone. She turned to glare at him, her chest heaving with every ragged, desperate breath. "You signed those papers because you wanted this wedding to be perfect. You wanted to impress these people just as much as I did. Do not you dare pretend you were an innocent bystander. The crowd erupted into a chaotic, murmuring mess. People stood up, grabbed their wraps, and began to filter toward the exits in a hurried, awkward procession. The illusion of the perfect family had been replaced by the sordid, ugly reality of greed, and nobody wanted to remain in the splash zone of the ensuing disaster. I stepped closer to my mother, keeping my voice low and devoid of the theatrical anger she had used to control me for decades. You spent his life savings on flowers, dresses, and a luxury resort. You treated the man who sacrificed his youth for this country like a disposable asset, and you spent 2 years trying to convince the world that I was the one who abandoned him. I did what I had to do, Diane hissed, her face twisted into a mask of pure spite. He was dying. He was never going to understand where the money went anyway. We deserved something for the years we spent dealing with his misery. He deserved to die with his dignity intact, I replied, my voice hard and cold as iron. He deserved to be surrounded by the people who loved him, not trapped in a facility where you held his personal phone hostage to rewrite his reality. Natalie took a shaky step toward me, her veil trailing behind her like the broken wing of a bird. She looked desperate, her mascara smeared across her cheeks, her once pristine appearance in tatters. "Give me the box, Claire. Just give me the box and go. We can talk about the money later. We can fix this if you just leave now." I looked at my sister, seeing her not as the golden child who had everything, but as a small, frightened person who had built a life on a foundation of sand. She was never going to fix anything because she had no idea what it meant to take responsibility. "This is not a family matter, Natalie," I said, repeating the Major's earlier warning. "It is an exploitation case. My attorney has everything. The nursing home logs, the bank transfers, the fraudulent power of attorney, and now the statement from the nurse who witnessed you both blocking my access to him." I turned my attention to the groom. Mason stood near the stage, watching the unraveling of the Maddox family with a detached, professional calm. He was not here to save Natalie, and he was certainly not here to pick a side in a petty argument. He was here to witness the truth. "Major Reed," I said, nodding toward the exit, "I have no desire to create further disruptions. I am leaving, and I am leaving the box with the relevant financial documents for your review, should you need them for your own peace of mind regarding this entire situation." "I do not need the box," Mason said, his voice clipped and decisive. "I have heard enough. I will be contacting my own legal counsel first thing tomorrow morning to ensure my name is completely removed from any future ties to this family's financial dealings. And I will be filing a formal statement regarding the nature of the false reports brought to me about your service record." My father let out a sharp, strangled sob from the banquet chair, but nobody looked his way. My mother leaned against the table, her strength failing as the reality of the impending investigation took hold. I left the silver box sitting right on the banquet table next to the remnants of the cold, untouched appetizer plates. It contained every piece of ammunition needed to ensure that no one in this family would ever be able to lie about the past again. I walked toward the ballroom exit, passing hundreds of empty seats and dozens of confused, awkward guests. I did not rush. I did not look back to see if Natalie was screaming, or if my mother was trying to spin one final, pathetic tale to save her reputation. As I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the cool, silent air of the hallway, I felt the tight, burning knot in my chest finally begin to untangle. I reached the lobby of the hotel, the space quiet and beautifully empty after the chaos of the ballroom. I walked to the entrance, the cool night air hitting my face as I stepped out onto the marble steps. I took a deep, steady breath, filling my lungs with the scent of rain and damp asphalt. For the first time in 3 years, I felt entirely steady. I had done what I promised my grandfather I would do, even if he was not there to hear it. I had cleared the air of the poison they had pumped into it, and I had reclaimed my own story from the wreckage they had tried to create. I reached into my pocket, feeling the cold weight of my own phone against my palm. I opened the group chat my mother had used to isolate me, the thread filled with lies and manufactured dramas about my supposed mental health. I hovered my finger over the block button for a single final moment. There was nothing left to say to them. There was no apology they could offer that would ever fix the empty seats at the nursing facility or the stolen months of Grandpa's life. I tapped the screen once, effectively severing the final thread of the obligation they had used to control me. The night air was calm, and the city lights glowed softly in the distance, promising a future that no longer required me to play a role in their manufactured theater. I walked toward my car, my steps light and deliberate, leaving the trash in the hallway and the broken pieces of my family far behind. I was finally done with the seating charts, the wedding favors, and the suffocating pressure of a legacy that never belonged to me in the first place. I had walked into that hotel, expecting to be humiliated, but instead, I had walked out with everything that actually mattered. The air in the hotel lobby felt thin and sterile, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the bridal suite. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, waiting for my blood pressure to settle. My phone buzzed in my hand, a steady vibration against my palm, but I did not look at the screen. I knew who was calling, and I knew exactly what they wanted. I simply dropped the phone into my bag, ignored the ringing, and kept walking toward the parking garage. Richard caught up to me just as I reached the dark concrete rows of parked cars. He was panting, his tuxedo jacket missing its boutonniere, his bow tie hanging loose and crooked against his dress shirt. He looked aged, like a man who had suddenly realized he had spent his entire life building a house out of straw. "Claire, stop," my father gasped, bracing his hands against his knees to catch his breath. "You cannot just drive away. Diane is calling the police. She is telling them you stole the inheritance box and that you are having a mental breakdown." I paused, leaning against the cold pillar of the parking structure. I looked at the man who had stood silently by while my mother erased my existence for years. Let her call them Richard. The officer will find a box full of notarized documents, bank statements that prove theft, and a nurse's statement regarding the exploitation of a vulnerable adult. If she wants the authorities to arrive, I will be the one who welcomes them. My father flinched, his shoulders sagging further. "She is my wife, Claire. I cannot let you destroy her." "You already did that, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You did that the moment you put your signature on a document you knew Grandpa did not understand. You chose her comfort over his dignity. Now, you have to live with the consequences of that choice." He stood silent for a long time, the only sound the hum of the distant city traffic. Finally, he straightened his back, though he still looked broken. "She kept telling me it was fine. She said you would never know." "I knew," I replied. "I just did not know how deep the rot went until today." I turned away from him and climbed into my car. As I pulled out of the garage, I saw Mason standing near the hotel entrance. He was talking to a plainclothes security officer, his posture rigid and formal. He did not look for me, and he did not wave. He was simply documenting the facts, clearing his own name, and ensuring he remained untainted by the scandal. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were finally steady. I sat in the darkness of my living room for a long time, listening to the silence. My laptop hummed on the desk, waiting for the final documents I had prepared. I opened the file containing the legal package, confirming everything was ready for my attorney in the morning. Then I remembered the phone. I pulled it from my bag. 20 missed calls from Diane, 12 from Natalie, a handful of frantic texts from Aunt Linda begging for the truth. I did not respond to any of them. Instead, I searched the archives of my emails, looking for a forgotten file from the estate planning office. I needed to confirm one final detail regarding the fiduciary oversight of the remaining assets. As I scrolled, I found a digital folder labeled Grandpa Thomas. Inside, there was a scanned copy of his final handwritten will, dated 3 years before the exploitation began. It was simple, clean, and entirely untouched by my mother's influence. I saved the file to my desktop, a sense of relief washing over me. The legal battle would be long, but the foundation was solid. The phone buzzed again, lighting up the room with a sharp, white glow. Another call from Natalie. I watched the screen for a moment, contemplating the sheer audacity of her desperation. She was probably standing in that empty ballroom right now, screaming at the empty tables, wondering why the world had stopped playing along with her performance. I reached out and finally tapped the block button. The silence of the apartment felt heavy and sacred. I was no longer the disgraced daughter or the family secret. I was simply Claire Maddox, and for the first time in years, the future was entirely mine to define. My attorney's office in downtown Washington was a fortress of quiet professionalism, miles removed from the toxic chaos of the ballroom. I sat in a leather chair that smelled of polish and old paper, listening to the steady hum of a city that never stopped working. Across the desk sat Marcus, a man who possessed a bulldog reputation and a heart of cold steel. He spent the last hour meticulously reviewing the digital package I had provided. "The court granted emergency restrictions on the remaining assets this morning, Claire," Marcus said, his voice clipped and precise. He tapped a finger against a stack of official court filings. "Your mother and sister no longer have the authority to move a single cent from the Grandpa Thomas estate accounts. Everything is officially frozen while the investigation proceeds." I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. The fight was far from finished, but the bleeding had finally stopped. "What about the additional transfers you mentioned on the phone?" I asked, keeping my focus on the legal reality of the situation. Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the latest report from the forensic accountant. "We received the facility records through the proper court process yesterday afternoon. The timeline is much worse than we initially thought. They did not just pay for the wedding and the resort, they were siphoning off regular installments for almost 2 years. It looks like they were using the Grandpa Thomas accounts to cover private credit card debt, luxury shopping sprees, and even private school tuition for your sister's young cousins." I stared at the wall, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. The scale of their greed was breathtaking. They had used every resource at their disposal to build a comfortable, extravagant life while my grandfather was sitting by a window in a nursing home, wondering why his own family had stopped calling his name. "They were so reckless," Marcus said, his voice laced with a faint, professional disgust. "They left a paper trail that would be impossible for even the most expensive defense team to explain away. I am filing the formal petition for restitution tomorrow morning. We are going to ask the court to place a lien on your parents' primary residence to ensure the estate is made whole. My father is listed on the house deed," I reminded him, my voice steady. "It does not matter," the attorney replied, writing a quick note on his notepad. "Given the evidence that he acted as a witness for a fraudulent power of attorney, he is fully liable for the financial damages alongside Diane. They are a single entity in the eyes of the court for these specific debts." I thought of Richard in the parking garage, his tuxedo jacket torn and his bow tie loose. He had spent his entire life bending to my mother's will, convinced that he was keeping the family together by staying silent. Now, he would be forced to lose the very roof over his head to pay for the choices he had made. "What happens to Natalie?" I asked, knowing the wedding was only the beginning of her public collapse. "Her firm has already suspended her indefinitely pending the outcome of the investigation," Marcus said, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in his tone. "The wedding planner, Evelyn Price, has already turned over every single text message and email regarding the wedding arrangements. Your sister is staring down a future where no reputable company in the region will even touch her application." I stood up, gathering my coat. The legal battle would drag on for months, but the power my mother held over me had vanished. I was no longer a secret to be kept or a story to be manipulated. I was the person holding the pen, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the only one writing the next chapter. "Keep me informed of every development," I said, offering him a firm, professional handshake. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with the prospect of the case. "Go home, Claire. You have done the hard part. Let the legal system handle the rest." I walked out of the office and into the cool, bright daylight of a new morning. The city moved around me, oblivious to the destruction of a suburban empire. I realized then that my victory was not in the money they would be forced to return, or the houses they would lose, or the reputation that would never recover. My victory was the simple, beautiful ability to walk away without looking back. The final mediation meeting took place in a windowless conference room on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. The air smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee, a cold, bureaucratic environment that offered absolutely no hiding places for family theater. Marcus sat to my right, his fingers tapping a steady, rhythmic pattern against a thick manila folder containing the finalized court orders. Across the wide oak table sat my mother, my father, and my sister. They were flanked by a court-appointed criminal defense lawyer and a separate civil attorney, whose expression suggested he had spent his entire morning trying to convince his clients that they had absolutely no leverage left. Natalie looked completely unrecognizable without her heavy bridal makeup and manicured poise. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven ponytail, and she wore a plain gray sweater that seemed to swallow her small frame. The perfect public mask had vanished, replaced by a dull, hollow stare. Her marketing firm had terminated her employment a week after the wedding, and the local news coverage of the ballroom livestream had turned her name into a warning label in the Northern Virginia business community. She was 32 years old, completely unemployed, and staring down a future built on a mountain of civil liability. Diane sat beside her, clutching a tissue in her shaking hand, her eyes locked on the table. The silver evening gown was gone, replaced by a drab blazer, but she still tried to maintain a fragile posture of maternal martyrdom. It was a pathetic, empty performance that no longer carried any weight. "Let us review the terms of the restitution agreement," Marcus stated, his clear voice echoing off the stark walls. "The court has finalized the independent fiduciary appointment to manage the remainder of the Thomas Maddox estate. Neither Diane nor Natalie will ever have access to those funds again." My mother let out a small, wet sniffle but did not lift her head. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, sliding a 3-page document across the polished wood, "the total amount of unauthorized transfers has been calculated at $98,000. To guarantee the full recovery of these funds, a civil judgment lien has been placed on the primary residence of Richard and Diane Maddox. If the restitution is not paid in full within 18 months, the court can authorize a forced sale or foreclosure action to satisfy the judgment." My father let out a heavy, ragged sigh, his large shoulders slumping forward until his forehead almost touched the table. He looked at the signature line on the document, his hand trembling as he reached for a cheap plastic pen. He had spent his entire life taking the path of least resistance to keep his wife happy, and now that path had led him to the edge of homelessness. He signed his name quickly, a weak, defeated motion that officially surrendered his remaining pride. "This is completely unfair," Natalie whispered, her voice cracking as she finally looked up to glare at me. "You ruined my life, Claire. You took my wedding, my job, my husband, and my home. You destroyed this family just to prove a point." I looked at my younger sister, feeling an overwhelming sense of emotional distance. The anger that had lived behind my ribs for years was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, absolute stillness. "I did not take anything from you, Natalie," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "You spent his care money on a resort in the Maldives while his nursing home checks bounced. You stood in a hotel corridor and called me a lowly grunt, because you were terrified I would look at the bank statements. Your own choices brought you to this table, not mine." My sister looked toward her defense attorney, but the older man simply closed his briefcase with a loud, definitive snap. He had already told them that going to trial against a decorated military officer with a paper trail of forensic accounting would result in a devastating finding of civil liability with a serious risk of criminal charges for forgery and elder exploitation. "We are done here, Natalie," the defense attorney said softly, rising from his chair. "Sign the restitution order so we can conclude the civil proceedings." With a shaking hand, my sister grabbed the pen and scribbled her signature at the bottom of the page. She didn't look at me, and she didn't look at our parents. She simply stood up, grabbed her canvas bag, and hurried out of the conference room without saying goodbye to anyone. My mother rose next, her movements slow and fragile. She looked at me for a long, agonizing moment, her mouth twitching as if she wanted to offer one final, desperate lie to salvage her dignity. I met her gaze with a flat, unwavering stare. Diane quickly looked away, grabbed her husband by the sleeve of his worn jacket, and guided him out into the hallway. I watched them go, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the final echo of their footsteps. "What about the restitution funds, Colonel?" Marcus asked, gathering the signed documents and sliding them into his briefcase. "Once the house lien is cleared and the money is recovered, how do you want the attorney's office to distribute the checks?" "I do not want a single dollar of it," I replied, standing up and pulling on my uniform coat. "Every cent recovered from the restitution order, after your legal fees are deducted, is to be transferred directly into a specialized trust fund for veteran elder care. It will be managed by an independent trustee, and it will bear the name of Grandpa Thomas Maddox." Marcus offered a warm, genuinely respectful smile, giving me a sharp nod of deep appreciation. "He would be incredibly proud of you, Claire." "He already was," I said. 3 days later, I drove out to the small national cemetery in the Virginia countryside. The morning air was crisp and completely silent. A beautiful, peaceful expanse of green grass and uniform white headstones that stretched toward the blue horizon. The frantic noise of the city and the toxic drama of my family felt a million miles away. I walked down the row of white marble markers, my uniform shoes clicking softly against the stone pathway. I stopped when I reached the headstone bearing his name, Thomas Maddox, United States Army. I knelt beside the manicured grass, the morning dew cold against the fabric of my trousers. I reached into my pocket and pulled out his old gold pocket watch, the tarnished metal smooth and warm from the heat of my palm. I set the watch gently against the base of the marble headstone, right next to a small bronze challenge coin I had left there the previous week. "I cleared the air, Grandpa," I whispered, looking at the carved letters of his name. "Nobody is lying about you anymore, and nobody is using your memory to pay for flowers. Your story belongs entirely to you now." I stood up, squaring my broad shoulders, and took a deep, steady breath of the clean country air. I did not feel bitter, and I did not feel lonely. The suffocating weight of the obligation my mother had used to control me had lifted completely, leaving behind nothing but a profound, enduring peace. I turned my back on the headstone and walked toward my car, my steps light and deliberate. I knew I would never receive an apology from Diane, and I knew Natalie would spend the rest of her life blaming me for the wreckage of her own ambitions. It didn't matter. I did not need their permission to exist, and I certainly did not need them to give me a seat at their table. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the cemetery gates. As I reached the main highway, I looked in the rearview mirror, watching the white headstones fade into the quiet green hills behind me. I was finally leaving the corridor, the trash bins, and the broken pieces of my childhood far behind. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. My hands were entirely clean, and the road ahead of me was completely wide open. You have reached the end of this story, but the truth it holds is one you might recognize in the quiet corners of your own life. When you look at the people around you, you need to understand that blood does not grant anyone the right to erase your dignity, nor does it entitle them to rewrite your history for their own benefit. Too many women spend their entire lives sitting in hallways they did not choose, waiting for a seat at a table that was designed to keep them small and silent. You have to realize that the most dangerous lies are the ones told by the people who claim to have your best interests at heart, especially when those lies are wrapped in the soft, suffocating language of family duty. The lesson here is simple but incredibly difficult to practice. You do not need an apology to move forward, and you certainly do not need the approval of those who have spent years profiting from your perceived weakness. My family relied on the assumption that I would prioritize their reputation over the truth, and for years, they were right. They counted on my silence to keep their exploitation hidden in the dark, just as they counted on my shame to keep me from asking questions about who was really in control. But once you decide to stop participating in the performance, once you stop caring about what the neighbors will think, and start prioritizing what is objectively true, the power they hold over you vanishes entirely. You do not owe your life, your hard-earned money, or your professional honor to anyone, regardless of what names they share with you. If you find yourself being told that you are too sensitive, or that your memory of the past is flawed, you need to start gathering your own evidence before you ever try to confront the people who have spent years dismantling your reality. Keep your own records, trust your own instincts, and do not be afraid to seek professional guidance when someone is attempting to strip you of your agency. Protecting your future is not an act of malice, it is an act of survival. Never let someone else convince you that your dignity is a negotiable asset in their pursuit of a comfortable life at your expense. You are the only person who can truly claim ownership over your story, and you have every right to stand tall, even if standing tall means walking away from the people you once loved the most. Take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Have you ever stayed in a situation or a relationship because you were afraid of the scandal or the social consequences of finally speaking up? Think about the people in your life who have made you feel small, or who have used your silence to build a narrative that benefits them while leaving you behind. What would your life look like if you stopped asking for their permission to be treated with basic respect? And what is the one piece of evidence you have been ignoring simply because you are afraid of the fallout? I hope that sharing this has given you a mirror, and I would love to know, what is the one boundary you have finally decided to set for your own peace of mind, and how does the world look now that you have stepped out of the hallway and into the light?